Really, the impetus for this talk comes from the fact that I've always enjoyed doing journal clubs in my classes, but when I came to Tufts, I found that my classes were getting larger and larger. And the class that I currently teach, which I'm going to talk about today, molecular biology, has more than 120 students in it now. And I just didn't want to give up this opportunity that students have to engage with the literature when they're doing it with journal clubs. So this is kind of a tips and techniques talk where I'm just going to share with you all of the things that I've developed over the 15 years I've been doing this. Hopefully some of them you'll find useful for your own classes. So the context of the class, it's an upper level molecular biology class. There will be 130 students enrolled next year, which kind of scares me. It's a mix of juniors, seniors, and graduate students from a wide variety of scientific backgrounds. So we have many biology majors, but also biochemistry and bioengineering students. The class meets twice weekly for 75 minutes each. The journal club fits into one of those 75-minute classes, and there are optional recitations of 50 minutes students can attend. The goals that I had in introducing this idea of journal clubs in large classes was I wanted to make sure that the students could get experiences reading and analyzing papers from the primary literature. We all know that that's how you really get into the meat of what science is, and I wanted students to be able to do that. I also wanted to have both asynchronous and synchronous opportunities for students to talk about the papers. So not just in the class, but outside of class as well, with many different groups of students. And I wanted to show the students that science is really done by people, by a diverse group of students, or scientists, as we just heard about in the last talk from Josie, and also the fact that this is usually done in teams. So I think part of what makes this work is the fact that you have to choose really good papers. And while it would be wonderful if students could choose papers on their own when you're dealing with a class of more than 100 students, that just isn't feasible. So I think what really sets this up is taking time to find papers that are going to tie in with the course material and be appropriate for the level of the students. And I'll be honest, sometimes it can take me 1 to 2 full days in the summer to identify the papers that I'm going to use any given semester. I choose new papers each year just because otherwise I start to get bored, and I don't like being bored. So I have found that papers from the 1990s and the 2000s are often good, especially for the initial papers. As the students get more experience in reading the literature, they're able to read papers that are more modern. I usually avoid Cell Science, Nature, and other journals where the papers are too long, especially with 20 supplemental figures. That's just too much to deal with. And I want to make sure that the material can synergize with the course content. So we choose 3 papers, usually of increasing difficulty, and they're spread throughout the semester, basically 1 per unit of the course. Now, as you might imagine, many students come into the course, especially juniors and sometimes the sophomores, with very little or no experience with reading the primary literature. So I do a couple of things to try to get them a little bit more familiar with papers and just more comfortable with them. One of them is a scavenger hunt that we do 3 weeks before the first journal club. After this presentation is over, I'll be happy to post an example of a scavenger hunt that I used last year. And these scavenger hunts require students to examine all parts of the paper, not just the figures, not just the results. We have them look at author bylines, we have them look at funding sources, we have them look at acknowledgements, just to kind of show them all of the parts that go into a publication such as this and all the different things, all the different places where they could find information. At the end of this scavenger hunt, students get into small groups. They discuss strategies that they've used in the past to read papers if they have experiences with this. And then we also talk about how to interpret a figure, even though they haven't dealt with any of the science yet for that figure. We just talk about, well, what are the parts of a figure and what are some of the things that you might want to be looking for? Before the journal club, this is usually 1 to 2 weeks before, we provide students with a PDF copy of the paper on a platform called Perusal, which some of you may be familiar with. This is freely available, so it's something that the students don't have to pay for. We like this platform because of some of the tools that it provides instructors, but there are other platforms like Hypothesis, which we think could also work for this. And the way that we do this with a class of more than 100 students is we assign the students into small groups, about 10 to 12 students per group, so that not every student is annotating the same copy of the paper. If you have 100 students making notes, asking questions and comments on a paper, it quickly becomes unreadable. So dividing them into smaller groups makes this a little bit more feasible. They can do this asynchronously. So if they're up at 3 in the morning, they're scrolling through the paper, they have a question, they can either highlight the text, or they can drop a pin at a certain point on the paper, and they can write a comment, or they can ask a question. And we encourage the students to visit the paper multiple times. This allows them to both make comments and ask questions on their own, and then respond to their classmates' comments and questions. One of the really nice features of Perusal is that it allows students to upvote comments and questions, which not only allows them to kind of clue in on what's attracting the most attention, but also the instructors to know where are the real points of confusion, or what are things that students find interesting. Perusal is very flexible. It can be used to grade the student comments. There's an algorithm that Perusal uses to do this. I'm not a huge fan of it, so what I typically do is I will holistically assess the comments and questions that each of the students are leaving, and you could just not grade them at all. You could just do it based on participation. And as I said, what Perusal does is it provides us with a window into student thinking. So I want to show you an example of this. This is an example of one group's set of Perusal annotations from a paper that we read last fall. Any place where you see yellow highlighting, that's a place where a student either asked a question or made a comment. And what you see in pink here, these are all of the comments or questions that were made just based on this particular part of the PDF paper. And so you can see what happened in this particular thread of comments is first a question was asked, well, why not positive supercoils? A student kicked in 7 days later, interestingly enough. So it took a little while, but they said, hey, I watched some lecture videos and I saw this. 5 days later, another student said, I think positive supercoiling is more uncommon. And as we get closer to the assignment deadline, you can start to see that students are interacting more and more with this. You can also see that some of these comments and questions are being upvoted. That's what these +1s represent here. One of the great things about Perusal is it provides a lot of useful metrics for the instructor. So here you're starting to see the overall assignment process. You can see both as a class and for individual groups and students who's engaged with it, who hasn't. And you can look at, for example, most upvoted questions or annotations, so that as you're preparing for the actual journal club, the in-class journal club that's going to take place, you can know where you want to focus your attention, which figures gave the students problems, what questions do they have, what did they find really cool. So I think Perusal really helps to make this valuable for the students before they even come into class. And then for the in-class journal club, remember, this is being done with over 100 students in a large lecture hall. So my goal is really, let's keep the students engaged and let's give them multiple opportunities to talk about the paper. I'm going to go through on the next few slides all of these different components of the in-class journal club. Anything in blue is something that the students are largely responsible for, and anything in green is something that the instructor largely does. And these are times that I've found work pretty well if you have a 75-minute class to do this. So the first thing, I call this the vent session. This is an opportunity for students just to talk about their experience in reading the paper. So they come into class, and the way that we assign the groups for these journal clubs is basically who are you sitting next to? And we ask that the groups are fairly small, about 3 to 4 individuals. They have 5 minutes just for open discussion in their groups. It gives them a chance to talk about how it went for them. Sometimes after a few minutes, once they're done griping, they start to talk about the most interesting or confusing parts of the paper. And all I'm doing as an instructor during this time is roaming around the room and listening to the student voices. Then I bring everyone back together and I set the stage for the paper, give a little bit of background. I try to establish the context. I remind them, why did we read this paper? What does it connect to what we've been talking about in class? I always focus on the authors and where they might be from. So this was, for example, the first slide from a journal club last fall. It's nice to have pictures, names of the authors, and even on a map, identify where's the lab actually located. And then I try to, again, make connections to the class material. I'm very active during this part because I'm presenting. Then comes, this is fun. This is the fun part. So remember, the students are in groups of about 3 or 4. I'm going to assign each group of students a particular figure or a couple of panels from a figure. And the way that I do it is before class, I prepare different colored index cards with selected parts of figures written on each of these cards. And then I and my TA, we just go around the room once the students are in group. In this part, we hand them an index card and we say, you have 15 minutes to prepare someone in your group to present the material in this figure, answering these 4 questions. Now, the reason we do it this way is that means everyone's still on the hook here because they don't know who's going to actually be presenting. Everyone needs to be paying attention and being prepared so that they're ready if they get called to present later. And so the instructor role during this 15-minute period is guide and support, encourage questions, see where the groups are having trouble, see if there are techniques they didn't understand. I'm able to do this with just one TA and myself, but I'll tell you, I'm out of breath once this is all over because it's a lot of running around the room to make this work. And then after those 15 minutes, we choose the presenters and prepare them for the presentation. And we do this fairly randomly. So I get them all quieted down and I say, okay, the person who's going to be presenting from your group is the person whose birthday is next, or whose last name starts with a certain letter, or the person who woke up latest today. Importantly, I think this should be kind of fun and should be something unrelated to academics so that it's not singling out individuals based on race, gender, socioeconomic status, anything like that. And then in these next 10 minutes, I'm running around the room again, making sure that all the presenters give me the thumbs up and they say, yes, we're okay to be ready to present. The next part of this journal club is figure presentations. Usually takes about 30 minutes. We don't ever do more than 6 to 8 figures in any given journal club. And so the assigned presenter will basically walk the class through the figure. They can do it from their seat if they're more comfortable. Remember, this is a lecture hall, or they can come up to the front of the room. I found that it helps to provide a microphone and a laser pointer so that they can be heard and that so they can point out things on the slide. And oftentimes they'll finish with questions or controversies that came up in their group during the discussion. My role during this part is to supplement information when necessary, clarify, clear up any confusion if there is some, and then probe if there's time, if it's appropriate, and if I feel like the student is able to answer questions. And then we wrap up. This is usually the last 5 minutes of class. We'll deal with final questions or confusing points. I will usually restate the connection of the paper with class material, talk about how it's going to connect to what's coming in the future. And if there have been additional papers on this topic that have been published since this one was, which is often the case, sometimes we'll talk a little bit about this. And the role here, I just want to make sure that I'm creating closure and connecting. So, last thing I want to talk about, and I'm going to bring in Jessica in just a minute, is engaging with the authors. I've chosen to do this only for our final journal club, and the reason for this is it's a fair amount of work, but I've found it to be really powerful, and the students just love it. And so what happens is for that third paper, after the students have read it, they work in groups to propose a what's next experiment, and they submit these group assignments in lieu of a final exam before class. And then during the scheduled final exam period, we meet with the authors of the paper. Sometimes this is in person. Most of the time it's on Zoom. One thing to keep in mind is that if you have a final exam slot or time, you want to make sure that the paper you're choosing for this last journal club, that the authors are in a time zone that makes this workable. And sometimes I found that's not the case. So I will usually email either the last author or the first author or any other authors on the paper at the start of the semester and say, would you be willing to meet with the class at the end of the class? To talk about the paper, your lab, the research in your lab, and importantly, their career. About a week before we do this, students submit questions that they and their groups want to ask the authors. And then I compile these and send them to the authors about 2 to 3 days before the final meeting so they have a sense of what might be coming. And then I really turn it over to the students. So this is usually between an hour and a half. The author comes and introduces themselves, and then I turn the conversation over to the students and have them ask as many questions as they want. It's in the past been very dynamic, a lot of fun. I just sit back and enjoy. And some of the students continue to correspond with the authors after the class and reach out either because they're interested in the research or they want career advice or something like that. And so I'm going to turn the floor over now to Dr. Jessica Silva-Fisher, with whom we collaborated on this at the height of the pandemic with one of the papers that her lab published then. So Jessica, here's your slide.
Thanks, Mitch. So I'm really excited to kind of just give you the perspective of a future author of the class. I was, first really excited of just not getting the invitation from the students, right? Because they really liked my science and they really liked the background of what I did. But, they also had bigger, broader career development questions, which I thought was really exciting. As Mitch said, I received many questions that were pre-prepared from the class. And I thought that was wonderful, right? Because you get to look at the questions and kind of have an idea of, where they're kind of going with their journal club. So on the slide, you can kind of see these are the real questions that they asked me that I received. You can see there are various ranges, right? I got questions, specific details about the paper, the scientific process in developing the paper. I got many questions even about my research plans for my lab. At the time, as Mitch said, it was during the pandemic and I had just opened my lab. So this is the perspective of a young investigator just starting out. Many of the thoughts and questions, once I was actually in the journal club, they were very inquisitive, but they not only were really creative, but they even gave me ideas about the next steps of what I should do, right, on my research. So that was exciting. And there were not only questions about the science of the paper, but also, about my personal career path. Questions about my career, how I chose my career path, about even several, I do a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So they asked about that. And then they also asked me questions just, overall about being a woman in STEM and also an underrepresented person in STEM. So that was also, really, really nice. So pretty much overall, I saw, the direct benefit to the students. And how they learned to thoroughly review a paper, how they got the excitement to meet the author, which was really nice. They were able to ask many different questions, but it also benefited me, which was great, right? I got to have the interaction with the students. I was able to network with new faculty from a different university. I was able to meet many students. As Mitch said, several of them even contacted me after I gave the talk, which was great. And then of course you feel that direct impact of the paper that you published. And so it was all very exciting.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Our contact information is here and we're happy to take questions.
Wonderful. We have a time for a few, and we got a few in the chat already. So first off, perusal, do you have to pay for a license, or is that an institutional license you have?
So as I understand it, I could be wrong, please correct me, but I think it's freely available.
And if the students were working in groups, how did you assess their grades?
Absolutely. So I kind of see these journal clubs as an opportunity. This is formative assessment. So it's an opportunity for the students to engage with the material. How I assessed whether or not it was working is on the exams. I would give them examples from figures from other similar papers, and I'd ask them to interpret those figures. And that's how I assessed whether or not this was working.
And then the in-person groups are not the same as the perusal groups, right?
That's right.
Okay. Do we have any more questions that are popping up?
I'm looking at one here from Andrea. Let's see here, 3 to 4 students, 6. Yes, thank you, Andrea. Great point. So that's those, you may have noticed that the index cards were colored. So there aren't enough figures, right, to add up. You did the math to add up to more than 100 students. So what it means is when I call out a figure, I'll say, okay, there are groups that had figures 1A and B, for example. Let's pick the group with the blue group. And whichever group got the blue index card, they're on the hook for that. And all the other groups are like, phew, thank goodness. But they don't know until the very last minute that their group's actually going to be presenting. So everyone has to be prepared just in case. Great question, Andrea. Thanks.
Great question. Oh, one more. Let's do this. Does the author come in person, or did you do it remotely? And if you was in person, how did the logistics work?
Jessica, since it was during the pandemic, we decided for her not to come in person. I have had a couple of authors come in person. It's helpful if they're local, obviously. Zoom actually democratizes it quite a bit, I've found. And in fact, since there are often students who miss the final exam for whatever reason, especially since it's the end of the semester, I've started doing it on Zoom all the time just because that seems to make it better for everyone to attend.